your teacher. Teacher or coach? Is it teacher or coach?
Both.
Both?
Okay. Life coach.
Life coach. Wow. A value add in public school with a life coach. All right.
I'm Phil Koulis.
I'm Jenny McCarthy.
I'm Kevin Kohler.
I'm Renee Hannon. We're from Maine South High School in Parkridge, Illinois, and our teachers are Mr. Trinkle and Mr. Curra.
Are they both life coaches or just one?
Yeah, they're
I'm Tim Moore. I'm from the University of Wisconsin at Madison with a group called the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. We kind of swim around this stuff every day. It's kind of geeky, really.
And I'm Madeline Dunn, and I'm Curator of Education and Historian for Delaware's Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs.
I'm Doug Beckstead. I'm a historian for the U.S. Air Force up at Joint Base Ellenbrook, Richardson, Alaska. Nice bow tie.
Thank you.
A lot of that.
Never won one before.
Looks good.
Thanks.
I'll read the question and then we'll get down to business. Anti-federalism is the topic du jour here. An American historian writes that ideas put forth by the anti-federalists have surfaced again and again amongst later generations of Americans, end quote. Or begin quote. Those ideas, he claims, are vital and a vital element in the American political tradition and are properly viewed as the philosophy, as a part of the philosophy of the Constitution. You just read why. Why did the anti-federalists object to what they claim were broad grants of power to the federal government, such as in the necessary and proper general welfare? Nearly all anti-federalists agree that transfer of sovereignty to a national government would mean states would retain but a shadow of their former power. Evaluate their argument. You may begin.
Resisting the ratification of the Constitution and the chief executive in power, anti-federalist George Mason wrote that nothing is so essential to the preservation of Republican government as a periodical rotation. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, officially limiting America's president to 2 terms in office. Nearly 200 years later, Mason was finally vindicated, demonstrating the perpetuation of anti-federalist thought in the American political tradition.
At its most basic level, the differences between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were caused by opposing viewpoints on the appropriate size of government and distribution of power. The Anti-Federalists supported a government built on states, which served as small, homogeneous communities. Under the pseudonym Agrippa, James Winthrop wrote, "It is impossible for a code of laws to suit Georgia and Massachusetts." Clearly, the Anti-Federalists thought of the states as separate and unique entities, and that a blanket code of laws for the diverse nation would fail.
For this reason, the Anti-Federalists objected to the Constitution's large and distinct government that would lose touch with the local interests of the people and jeopardize their liberties. To alleviate these fears, Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights, which was finally secured through the First Congress. Even though the Bill of Rights appears to be the final contribution to American politics, Anti-Federalists thought they agreed all of American history. From the Democrat Republicans to the populists, from Barry Goldwater to President Reagan, Anti-Federalists thought Americans have always obeyed the issues of government size and state power.
In particular, the Anti-Federalists disputed the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8, arguing that it granted too much power to Congress. Under this clause, the Anti-Federalists argued, the legislative branch had no limits and could pass any legislation they deemed fit, potentially at the expense of personal liberties and state power.
State sovereignty would also be compromised by the taxing and spending clause's stipulation that the government should promote the general welfare through unspecified means. Just recently, Republicans have objected to the Democrats' loose interpretation of the general welfare clause as justification for the Affordable Care Act. In this way, the general welfare today is interpreted as the socioeconomic well-being of the American people.
During ratification, however, the Anti-Federalists feared that the phrase would justify unfair tax practices by Congress. One Anti-Federalist in Pennsylvania worried that Congress may monopolize every source of revenue, and thus indirectly demolish the state governments, for without funds, they could not exist. Overall, the Anti-Federalists objected to these ambiguous phrases due to the threats they pose to individual liberties and their treasured state power.
Under the new Constitution, states only retain the shadow of the power that they have delivered from the Articles of Confederation. For example, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution shifts power once exclusively held by the states to Congress, including powers to collect taxes and to regulate interstate commerce.
Also under the Articles of Confederation, the states were able to pick and choose which laws they would follow. The states believed this power to nullify laws allowed them ultimate sovereignty. But as the Civil War proved, and as Lincoln proclaimed in his first inaugural address, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments.
Because they were no longer sovereign entities, states could not nullify federal laws, nor could they secede from the Union. Clearly, under the new national government, the survival of the Union takes precedence over the power of the states.
Anti-federalist theory has always been a challenging force to the strong national government. Recently, states determined the legal statuses of same-sex marriages, gambling, and marijuana use within their borders. Since Nixon's presidency, block grants rather than categorical grants have been more common, allowing states a measure of autonomy with how they choose to spend federal money. Even though the anti-federalists may have lost ratification debate, clearly they have influenced our current government, and their ideas have won the hearts of generations of
All right, I need a little help here. Does this panel make any distinction between sovereignty and supremacy? I'm not sure. Is there a distinction between those two words, or are they the same thing in this panel's mind?
There's definitely a distinction between the two words. Sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were more like a treaty, a league of friendship between 13 sovereign states who determined their own laws and didn't really answer to the Continental Congress. But under the new federal government or national government, the national government is supreme over the state governments, but in the national government, the sovereignty is shared between the two.
Your question really kind of points to this ongoing struggle that we talked about in your speech, which is that there is this tug of war between supremacy and sovereignty. In the case decided by John Marshall in 1831, McCulloch versus Maryland, he determined that basically the national government set precedent over the states in establishing the second bank of the United States, and then the necessary and proper clause established implied powers that had supremacy over the states. However, we do see this issue of state sovereignty coming back again and again throughout history.
And to add on to what my colleagues were saying, while the Constitution does grant the federal government supremacy in Article 6, the states still retain power and still have sovereignty to the people who live in those states.
So why are the anti-federalists all worked up? States still have sovereignty. I mean, that's the federal response. So did the anti-federalists miss that distinction between sovereignty and supremacy?
Well, they were still wary of having a strong national government, as seen with the king in Britain. They didn't want their rights being taken away or a tyrannical government forming.
Also, as we mentioned in our speech, the reason the anti-federalists were afraid of the sovereign states was because of Shays' Rebellion before the Constitutional Convention. They worried that these people in these states would rebel against the national government and improve, as George Washington said, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other, all tugging at the federal hand, will soon bring ruin on the whole. There needs to be a strong centralized government that, I guess, dilutes the power of the states.
I would also argue that the anti-federalists were a bit distracted with the Bill of Rights. For example, Samuel Bryant, an anti-federalist, wrote in Centennial Paper 14 that, like a barrel tossed to a whale, people are to be amused with fancy amendments, till the harpoon of power should secure its prey, render resistance ineffectual. In other words, the barrel would be the Bill of Rights and the whale, I guess, is free for the central government.
I think
I'm sorry.
just in general, the anti-federalists would have preferred state governments and for the states to be supreme because they felt that that would better protect their rights.
In your opening statement, you made reference to the fact that throughout history, the size and power of government has been debated. What are some examples to support that?
A good place to point where presidential power kind of took office, starting with FDR was the first modern president. And what he did was that during World War II, he used the Commerce Clause, which was really never anticipated by the anti-federalists as a threat to their state sovereignty. But this Commerce Clause has been used again and again to justify growing government. And that can be seen in the case of Wickard versus Milburn in 1942. And that continued all the way up until United States versus Lopez in 1992, when the Supreme Court finally called back this vast grant of the Commerce Clause to use the government to expand.
Another example is during the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of slave states used states' rights as a rallying cry to prevent racial equality. And in 1980, President Reagan, on his presidential campaign, made a speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, at the site of the murders of 3 civil rights advocates, and said that he believes in states' rights. And this angered a lot of people who believed that he was justifying the actions of the murderers, and was just another example of people disagreeing over what states' rights really is and how it should work in the government.
You brought up Shays Rebellion. I'm a military historian. Why were the anti-federalists so opposed to expanding the military?
In the essay written by Brutus in the Anti-Federalist paper, the first essay, he states that that under the current system, under the current constitution, that the states would essentially disappear, and that in order to enforce laws, a standing army would be necessary. So their fears was that the standing army would basically be used to enforce laws that they felt that they were unjust, and they would have no way of standing up against the military.
In addition, under the Virginia Plan, the national government had the power to send in military troops to put down a state law or to put down a state rebellion or state law that wasn't in cohesion with the national government. And you can see that this perpetuated itself in the nullification crisis in South Carolina in 1832, when President Jackson, under the jurisdiction of the Force Bill, sent in troops to put down the uprising in South Carolina over the tariff eliminations.
Celia Kennedy said anti-federalists are men of little faith. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment? Really? And I have a feeling that would have been knocked out of the park, but we've got to move on. Unfortunately, we can't do that. Yeah. Let's give you a little feedback. You know, there's 3 statements in here that are very provocative, my mind's going a mile a minute. Not because they're wrong, but they're just downright provocative statements, and I think I appreciate that. I was a little nervous when you started out with just the chief executive, and then the presidential limitation amendment comes on a white horse, and that whole thing. But as you laid out that first part, is very good. You mentioned Agrippa. You don't hear much about Agrippa these days, so I was glad to hear that Agrippa gets in on here. And then I think it might have been Manny who said, look, but bear in mind, the anti-federalist, it's not just about Bill of Rights. Then he got to this, and then eventually, in follow-up, she got to the tub of the whale. Just a fantastic, it's a wonderful article. I don't know whether you read it by Ken Boland. It is great, and just like, well, poor Madison, he goes through this torturous process. So I think your statements about it's more than just a Bill of Rights is a very short sentence, but very, very important, and I appreciated that understanding. There are a couple of things I'm still a little fuzzy on the sovereignty versus supremacy thing. Is that I think at that phase you kind of were spinning your wheels on occasion, especially when it comes to how the Federalists try to explain. Don't worry about the sovereignty thing. This is just a supremacy thing. So I think there's still a little fuzzy in that portion of your presentation that I think could have been a little bit clearer. But you got the Lopez and Wickard as we started with Wickard, and then boom, Lopez ends this expansion. So I think that demonstrates a fairly sophisticated understanding as well. So on the whole, a very good presentation. I appreciate it a lot.
I thought you had a very strong opening statement, and there were several things that I appreciated throughout the discourse. Number one, your contrasts and comparisons between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, and the variety of historical and contemporary examples which you brought into your discussions to support your positions.
Usually we say you're all over the place, that's not a good thing. But you guys are all over the place, that's a good thing here. Because you had so many examples you were bringing in, you'd introduce something, then expand on it, contrast it with something else. So in this case, that's a good thing. I really liked your last presentation. Great participation between all of you, and you were very relaxed doing it. Sometimes I had to turn the screws and put you on the spot. It didn't work. We'll try later.